Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a feed of conversations that are delivered to you audially or visually through multiple platforms. But that's not important. What's important is designing better miniature games. And we are back talking about such a topic. That's me, Mike Hutchinson, and this chap, Glenn Ford. I was greatly moved by a YouTube video recently, and I explained it excitedly to Glenn, who wasn't really sure that he understood it or perhaps even agreed with it. So I thought I would make an impassioned explanation of this concept, this thought model, and I guess I'm excited about it because it explains something in my own game design process, and it unpacks something that I'd been worrying about over the last couple of projects and gives me a way of realizing that I'm not worried about it and it's actually perfect, and I've been doing a sensible process. So I can't remember the title of the YouTube video. We'll link it below. It was from a channel called Heart Beast, a chap called Benjamin who does tutorials on games design, and he appears to be an indie, like a solo games designer, video games designer, and he proposed this simple model which has worked very nicely in my brain. And that is that when you are working on a game, there are two phases. One of them we will call, for the sake of argument, prototyping phase, and another, for the sake of argument, we'll call the production phase. And that there comes in between these two phases a nominal production point, where you could say, for example, I've just hit the production point and I am now changing from the first phase to the second phase. So far, so simple. So the thing that I've done with Pacific Command, and I'll treat this one, I'll go with this one because it's nice and neat with this game. I had a early prototyping explosion of it where I was like, I've got the idea and I want to make it, and I made it, and I put together a rulebook for it, and I produced a 30-page rulebook, nicely laid out, because actually I wanted to learn InDesign, and it had illustrations because it was World War II, so I could grab like posters from the internet from the time, which are, royalty free. And I made something that probably I could have put on Drive-Thru-RPG and sold as a print-on-demand rulebook, and I showed it to a couple of friends, and that wasn't a production. That was still a prototype. Like, the fact that it was quite high res and it had illustrations and stuff, like, didn't get away from the fact that it was just something I had spaffed out briefly over a weekend, and it hadn't had that much thought, and it was maybe cool, maybe not, don't know, it doesn't really matter. The point was I was still very early on in the journey, and I at no point was confusing that with having gone through any stage of production, having gone through any like boring stage of like doing the work to make the game into its final incarnation. And then I had a period of like a year worrying about the game, thinking about the game, rewriting the game, scratching around in my notepad, and basically, in inverted commas, not making progress on the game if the way that you analyze that is through how many words have I completed in my rule book and how close to being done is it. And having got to multiple points of like, this feels okay, here's have a play test, and the game falling apart or not, and me wanting to change things, I like finally got to the point quite recently where I was like, yeah, I think this game is basically working. There's still some things that I'd like to buff the edges off, but I'm ready to go into production. And I want to go into production now because I want to get into the next stage, into the final kind of snowball rolling down the hill. So I had an opportunity last week to sort of shift gears, and I gave myself a deadline of launching a private beta copy, which meant I needed to put together like a draft rule book, and that was 9,000 words, and I put that out, and that sort of triggered me from this prototyping phase into a production phase where I just went, okay, new document, figure out my chapter structure, open a bunch of fresh documents, move all the text in, start writing. And I just started writing, and I was in the, this isn't particularly enjoyable or creative work insofar as like inventing games. It was just like doing the work of communicating clearly everything that had been in my brain and had been stewing for like a year or more. And so I like this idea that I changed from prototyping into production because it removes any, for me, false imagination that I am iteratively working towards something in a consistent way. And this, I think, is perhaps where, for Glenn and his brain, this model doesn't really mean anything, because you work, I think, in a more sort of sequential, accretive way than I am able to do. And so I flail around splashing bathwater all over the walls, trying to figure out like what the hell this even thing is. And then I go, Eureka, and I jump out of the bath and I go and write the thing down and get 22,000 words done in like a month. And that is because for me, this transition from I am thinking and worrying about it and designing to, right, it's just work mode. I have a deadline. And the deadline is interesting because deadlines are sometimes things for me that I like a month before the deadline or 3 months before the deadline, I have no choice but to change from prototyping into production. And like all the luxury of splashing the bathwater around that I had up until that point is gone. It's now go time. Like with whatever we've got, I've just got to move into production phase, fingers on keyboard, write the thing, communicate it clearly. Like the time for design meandering is over. That period is no longer available. And sometimes I think I've been a little bit lost and I've flip-flopped between this. I think Hobgoblin has had the least distinct version of this, where I had quite a long open beta with quite a lot of design freedom left open. And I think partly that was just that I wasn't in the best headspace for that period, and I actually wasn't doing a good job of keeping myself honest about whether or not the bonnet was open or not open at that point. It was also fun because there was a lot of interested people, and I think a lot of good conversations came from that extended playtesting period. However, I think for me, in looking at projects in the future, giving myself permission and freedom to be in prototyping, bathwater splashing, anything can get changed at any point. And particularly like I'm not writing a rule book, and even if I do write a rule book, it's not my final rule book and I'm going to throw it away. Just gives me total creative freedom to just not be tethered to anything that I'm doing during this prototyping phase. Like everything is deletable at all times until I hit the production point. It's like, no, it's go. Like everything now has a cost. Every change, every removal has a risk of putting this project at delay or whatever. So there we go. That's, I think, why it works for me and why I'm excited about the freedom that it gives me, or the structuring that it gives me.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. It's weird because I feel like, to me, the idea of there being this like mental changeover point from mentally I am prototyping and I am free to da 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 to click now, like in my mind I am achieving the production side of things. I don't know if that's like too disciplined, an internal mental structure for me or something, but it's like I can't imagine sort of doing that. It's like, for me, a game is a thing that I live with for a period of time, and I understand it and it understands me, and eventually we part ways and it goes off on its little journey. And sometimes we re-encounter somebody, each other, and I sort of drag it into an alleyway and completely mutilate it because I have better thoughts since last time we were together.
Really was wondering where that metaphor was going.
Well, no, because it's like, so I think my sort of process is like, I take a game and I start at the start of it and I go through until it is an acceptably finished game document thing. Everything basically works and hangs together. I go back to the start and make sure that all of the things I did at the end are no longer baloney, because I said, oh, things can have two jetpacks, And at the start, I say, if you've got 2 jetpacks, your head blows up. Okay, I have to change that. Go through, redo that so that everything makes sense. And then that sits off somewhere. Maybe it just sits off because it's like, okay, it needs to cook. Maybe I'll stick it up on Wargame Vault and see what happens with it. Maybe it's going off to a publisher or something, depending on how many sort of loops through this thing is. And if it's going off to a publisher, that's the last loop for that thing, probably for the foreseeable future. If it's on Wargame Vault and I get a better idea, it's like, okay, well, you need to come back in again because it's time for you to go down to the wrecking shop. But usually things are in a cycle, in and out, in and out, in and out, and they keep getting rebaked and rebashed. And the idea of going like, okay, we are now into the phase when not everything is like up for grabs. I don't know that I have.
But maybe this is a symptom of me having like published paper books where I can't go back. Like that's it. Like it's shipped and it will never be touched again unless I convince somebody to do a new version or edition of that game. Because like I can have another idea about A Billion Suns, but I can't, like, it exists now. Like I can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I guess what I'm really interested in is, as you described that, like, is your rule book like a sculpture? Like do you start with a rule book and that same rule book is still like, it's still there somewhere at the end? The first words are still, there's some echoes of them. Or do you design a game and it just exists in lots of different places, and then later on you're like, okay, now time to start the rule book? Or is the rule book like, is that the through line?
I mean, I personally, I find that usually when I sit down to write something, most of it's already there. And I'm just sort of writing it out and then finding out that some bits don't fit with the other bits once you can visit. It's, people talk about, is it like sculpting or painting? For me, it's sort of like putting together a piece of like IKEA furniture or something, where you just keep pulling like the bits out of your head. And then sometimes you go, oh my, no, these can't look. It
Give me the wrong
parts. I need to do something about this. And then and I get a hammer and I hit that bit until it fits into the other bit. And then, okay, there we go. We can keep building again. But it's almost always that the bits are all pretty much there when I sit down to write something, or I don't sit down to write it. And I don't.
Interesting.
And I don't tend to put it back into the cycle unless I think it's worth cycling it again. And I know where most of my designs are and when they're going to need another cycle and what sort of cycle they could use. It's like I'm currently having fun rewriting this thing called What Ho, which is a PG Woodhouse skirmish game. And I wrote it and I put it out into the world, and it was fine. It was fine, the thing I put out. And then there was no point going back to it because it was as good a version of that thing that it could be. And then I come up with an idea that's just like, right, no, that thing needs to go almost entirely into the bin. We'll take out that bit and that bit and that bit, but all the rest of it needs to be completely replaced because this is much, much, much better. And so it's going back through rewriting all of that from end to end.
Yeah, and I think that feels closer to the process that I went through with Gaslands and A Billion Suns and Hobgoblin and Pacific Command. Like that, it's just that, exactly which parts got changed. Like I didn't change like the central concept of like it's a spaceship game or whatever. Unlike, even though we talked about that on the previous episode. But yeah, like that idea of I'll have a finished rule book for some version of the game, but I'm allowed to just like cherry pick 3 or 5 things from that and then start again.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing where it's like, because obviously there is like an actual, I'm literally at the moment surrounded by produced things that I have written that are now in a very much locked state because
Glenn is surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with games of his own production that need to be shipped out.
yeah, and it's like, obviously there is very much a form of, okay, this is in production now, because
Yeah,
this is literally in production, it's going off to be physically made. um I don't know that I have um a mental way of boxing that off so cleanly. But then I think maybe I'm less worried about when things get locked in stone. I think I'm the sort of person who's relieved when it gets locked in stone and sent off, and I can never do anything more about it,
right.
because now it's time to move on. That's great. It's gone. It's what it is, you know. And I think you. I don't know, but I feel like you sometimes get more worried by that, because it's like,
I don't know. I mean,
I
yeah,
can't use
there
it
is
anymore.
definitely a sense of relief. I think there's also a palpable sense of I'm a terrible tinkerer, and like unless I give myself some rigor, like I will literally tinker forever
Yeah,
because I would rather tinker forever than finish it.
yeah.
But I have to finish it because I want to be a published game writer. So the thing has to get
Yeah,
finished.
yeah. And I do think, a certain amount of this is about, that you will keep coming back to it over and over and over, because that's your sort of one of your aspects, and it's
Mm,
like, this is a way you found to box out the that drive and say,
mm.
okay, this thing officially now has to go into the Tupperware, and sort of BC each of these pages are going off into the Chinese room, and you're not allowed to touch them anymore.
I think the other thing that feels quite meaningful about it for me is that because I'm because in many respects I'm quite disorganized. Like Glenn knows this about me. Like I I sometimes feel guilty, or like I feel like I ought to be doing better at like doing production-y things, doing writing earlier on in a process, because you've been quite forthright with this. It's like, well, if you work on things sort of earlier and more consistently, then you will have a calmer, less stressful life because you won't be cramming everything in at the end. And whilst that might be true, I think the counter for me is that I have these long amorphous periods of primordial soup followed by a Precambrian explosion of production, and being allowed to keep the ratios so out of whack is interesting to me, because that says like, oh, it takes me about 18 months to 2 years to write a game, of which at least 15 months of the 18 months is not writing the game, but it is writing the game, but it's just not writing the game rule book. And that's okay, and not to be worried or stressed about that, because I will write the rule book at the end. I'm not worried about that part. The fact that I didn't start the rule book on month 6 is a positive, because all the work I would have done in month 6 was garbage that would have had to have been thrown away and would never have made it into the final rule book anyway, because I'd have had another 12 months of primordial soup boiling.
Yeah, and I find that, I don't often find that I'm hit by things like writer's block, or not having something available to do. It's like I pull up a document for a game, I look at where I was last, and then I can write, a page or two, and that'll
Mm.
do for that day, and then I'll do that again the next day, and do that again the next day. And that's just how I write a thing when I'm working on things. I don't often do the, you know I mean, mainly because I don't often have the time to sit there and do like 20 pages at a stretch. It is like, okay.
Yeah, no, I think of it as the Murder She Wrote like thing where, yeah, there's just like hands on the keyboards close in with that music playing,
Yeah, no.
and as long as I can, like as much as that as I can get in a week, is my happy place.
Yeah, whereas I sort of like, a lot of the bulk of writing that I do is pulling up the laptop of an evening, knocking out two or three, like, a couple of factions or something like that, and
Mm.
it's time to go to bed. And that just seems a quite gentle way of doing it usually. And then you end up doing that. It's the Seinfeld approach of writing jokes. I've seen that documentary
No, I'd like to.
where Jerry Seinfeld apparently every day wrote like one post-it notes sort of a joke. And,
Right.
and there's a recent documentary, and there's a shot of him sitting on this like a road completely covered with little yellow post-it notes because he kept every single one of them in these files, and he didn't break that process for like whatever 40 years or something ever.
Yeah.
Every
Well, I mean,
day.
I can get down with that. Like, I do a lot of reps on games design. It's just it doesn't manifest in this way that you're describing for your process, which is like I am incrementally chipping away at like a sort of final version of the rulebook. That yeah, like every day I'll put at least half a page in my notebook where some idea will occur to me, and I get through a ton of these ring-bound notebooks. But yeah, anyway, so I think maybe what this conversation has proved to me is that finding an enjoyable mental model that helps for your own process is a wonderful thing,
Mhm.
and it's nice to share them, but it's equally not essential for anyone else to care or to get cross about the fact that they don't agree with that being a good model. So I'm cool with that.
No, absolutely, and I think sort of for various reasons over the last week, I've come to the conclusion that it's like what works for your creative process is what works for your creative process, and what your creative goal is your creative goal, and it's all fine, it's all good, and there's no point worrying that you're not a finisher, or that you've been working on something sort of perpetually and you keep going back. Don't worry about it. If it's the thing that's happening, it's the thing that's happening, and that's all right. Hopefully nobody is like going to be out on the street if they don't turn in a rule book in the next 6 months.
Yeah, I like that. I like that feeling. I have a post-it note stuck on the wall here with blue tack where I wrote a slightly sarcastic description of my own process, which is one, start too many projects, two, work on them for a bit, three, get distracted by something else, four, wait for the muse to return or a deadline to force the issue. And that's my entire process. But like, I've kept that post-it note for like 3 years on my wall because it's just an honest admission of like that's how my brain works, and I'm not going to beat myself up about that. And that's my creative process, and it's not somebody else's great. Sure as hell, not Glenn's creative process.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It
Yeah,
doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be, and it doesn't. And I don't need to be stressed about that, and I don't need to try and be somebody else's process.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, do what works for you, and it's nice, I think, if you can find like a little model that where you can go, yeah, that fits for me, because it's a little bit of fellow feeling in society to know that somebody else out there is having similar sort of shaped ideas.
Mm.
um but look, your creative process is fine, my creative processes are fine, your creative process is fine, dear viewer. If you have struggled with the demons of writer's block, and not feeling like you're getting things finished, or not feeling like you're approaching creative projects in the way that you're meant to be approaching them,
Mm.
in the fashion and the correct way. um you know it's fine, but swing down in the comment section, tell us about it, and we'll tell you it's fine, because it is fine, it's
Yeah.
okay. You do your own thing, do it your own way, don't finish it, do finish it, it's okay. You're here to work through a creative process, to work through an idea that's come into your head, and to get it to a state that you're happy to let it go again. Get the ideas out of your head so they don't drive you crazy, and that's sufficient, that's more than enough. And you know what? Swing by the Discord. There's lots of supportive people who are having creative struggles and difficulties, and having the imp of the creative sat on their shoulder and poking them and telling them they should be doing more with it. And it's all
Shitting down the back of their shirt.
yeah, and it's all total baloney, and it doesn't matter. There's no upside to being productive. There's no sort of great shining bell to be rung at the end of all of this. There's just, you doing what is best for your mental health and healthiest for you. And if you get a game out of it, that's nice as well.
It's bonus.
So on that, I think we're going to say a thank you and goodbye from this episode of Rule of Carnage. Please swing down into the comment section and give us a like and subscribe while telling us about your own struggles with creativity. But yeah, I think that's going to be it. So
All right.
And bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.